Falling Into You, a story of survival, secrets, and love, by Georgina Watkins and Finlay Hardins. She had exactly 3 rules about Finlay Hardins. Never be alone in a room with him. Never let him see you rattled. And never, under any circumstances, let yourself wonder what was underneath all that ice. Georgina Watkins had followed those rules for 2 years, 3 months, and 17 days. She had navigated his cold silences and his colder emails. She had swallowed her fury when he dissected her work in front of the entire senior team without once acknowledging that she had stayed awake 3 nights to produce it. She had built an entire internal architecture of controlled professionalism around the one unavoidable truth that Finlay Hardins was the most infuriating man she had ever had the misfortune of being employed by. She had no idea that 40,000 feet above the Atlantic, with the engines screaming and the world tilting at an angle it was never supposed to reach, all 3 rules would become completely and utterly irrelevant. Because when the Vantage Capital private jet began to tear itself apart against a ridge of Oregon wilderness, the only thing that mattered was survival. And when Georgina crawled out of the wreckage and found Finlay Hardins bleeding against the roots of an ancient Douglas fir, not barking orders, not issuing directives, just breathing, something cracked open inside her that she would never be able to close again. Some people meet their person across a crowded room. Georgina Watkins met hers in a forest that was trying to kill them both. Chapter 1. The turbulence started the way all disasters do. Quietly, almost politely. A nudge, a shiver in the fuselage. Nothing that would cause an experienced flyer to look up from their laptop screen. Georgina kept her eyes on the brand strategy deck she had been refining since takeoff from Portland. The flight to London was 9 hours. She had exactly 9 hours worth of work to avoid looking across the aisle at the man who had, in the span of a single Monday morning meeting, publicly dismantled the quarterly campaign she had spent 6 weeks building. Not unkindly. That would have been easier. He had done it efficiently, clinically, the way a surgeon removes a tumor, without malice and without apology. Finlay Hardins, CEO of Vantage Capital Group, occupied the world the way a storm front occupies a coastline. He did not need to raise his voice. He never had to. The air changed when he entered a room. His presence was a gravitational event, pulling attention toward him whether you wanted to give it or not. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of jaw that suggested the man had never once second-guessed a decision in his 38 years of life. His eyes were a pale, unsettling blue that always seemed to be calculating something several moves ahead of whatever conversation was currently happening. Georgina hated those eyes. She hated the way they swept over a room and found every weakness. She hated the way they had swept over her presentation this morning and found hers. She was deep in a paragraph about Q3 consumer behavior when the gentle shiver became a lurch. Her coffee mug slid an inch across the lacquered side table. She steadied it without looking up. Then the aircraft groaned. It was a sound that came from the bones of the plane, a deep, metallic moan of stress. Georgina's head snapped up. Across the aisle, Finlay was still reading from a printed report, his expression unchanged. But his right hand had gone white-knuckled on the armrest. The second lurch was violent. Her laptop skidded off the tray table, crashing to the cabin floor. The overhead bins burst open. Something, a briefcase, a coat, tumbled down. The high whine of an alarm split the pressurized air. And then one of the engines stopped. The absence of that sound was worse than any noise. It was a silence that had weight, a silence that meant something fundamental had gone wrong with the agreement between the aircraft and the sky. Georgina felt the floor pitch beneath her feet. Her stomach lurched upward into her chest. Outside her window, the serene gray expanse of cloud became a spinning, impossible blur of green and earth. She looked across the aisle. Finlay looked back at her. The mask was gone, not replaced by panic. That would have been almost comforting, but by something rawer, something primal and human and honest. His pale eyes were wide, and in them she saw the same stark, terrifying thing that was clawing through her own chest. The pure, stripped-down acknowledgement that this was real, that there was nothing either of them could do. And then the world ended. The impact was total. A wall of force and sound that slammed the air from her lungs, shattered the window beside her head, and then, mercifully, compressed everything into darkness. Silence. Georgina came back to herself slowly, like a swimmer rising through deep water. Her head throbbed with a percussive, bone-deep ache. She tasted copper. The cabin around her was unrecognizable, a cathedral of twisted aluminum and fractured composite, tilted at a grotesque angle. Through a gap where the fuselage had been sheared open, cold green forest air poured in, carrying the sharp smell of jet fuel and crushed pine. She was alive. The realization did not bring relief. It brought a second, suffocating wave of panic that she forced herself to breathe through, counting in and out the way her therapist had taught her during a darker chapter of her life. Her fingers found the seatbelt buckle. It clicked. She moved. Every rib screamed in protest. She dragged herself through the wreckage, over scattered debris. A single stiletto heel, a shattered champagne flute, a fanned-out deck of playing cards, and pushed through the torn fuselage into the pale, cold air of the Pacific Northwest. Her knees gave out. She hit the damp moss. The forest was enormous. Ancient. A towering cathedral of Douglas fir and Sitka spruce that rose 100 feet above her, their canopy a dense weave of needles through which only narrow spears of afternoon light could pass. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. That was when she heard it. A low sound. Human. She turned toward it and found him. Finlay Hardins was slumped against the base of a massive fir, his charcoal suit jacket torn at the shoulder, his white dress shirt dark with blood on the left side. A gash above his temple bled steadily, a dark thread tracing down his jaw. He was conscious, just barely, his pale eyes fighting to stay focused. She had never seen him like this. 2 years under the man's employ, and she had never once seen him look anything other than completely, almost offensively in control. Now he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had fallen out of the sky. "Are you injured?" His voice was a ragged scrape, but focused. The urgency in it was tightly controlled. Even now. "I do not think so." Her own voice came out strange, thin, belonging to someone else. He tried to push himself upright. His body betrayed him, a visible sway, a sharp intake of breath. Before she could think about it, Georgina was on her feet, crossing the distance, her hands gripping his arm to steady him. The fabric of his ruined suit was rough beneath her palms. His arm beneath it was solid as iron. She had never touched him before. In 2 years, they had never shaken hands. "Thank you," he said, very quietly. They stood there in the ringing silence of the aftermath, the sounds of the forest slowly returning around them. Birdsong, the creak of branches, the distant sigh of wind. Finlay's gaze swept the crash site, the calculation already visible in his eyes. The shift from victim to tactician. "We need to check for survivors," he said. Not an order. Not the way he usually issued directives. It was a statement made to an equal. They searched for an hour. They called out names into the green indifference of the trees. The answers they received were silence and more silence. The pilot's cabin was empty, unrecoverable. The co-pilot had not survived the impact. There was no one else. Just the two of them. As that reality settled in its full weight, Georgina felt the ground tilt. Not literally, but internally. A vertiginous recognition of the absurdity and the terror of their situation. Stranded. No signal. No way of knowing if anyone even knew where they had gone down. Finlay turned to her. He pressed a torn strip of his shirt against the cut on his forehead. His pale eyes met hers, and what she saw there was not fear. It was something far more dangerous. Determination. Absolute and unqualified. "We are going to walk out of this," he said, his voice low and bedrock steady. "Both of us. I promise you that." Georgina Watkins had spent 2 years not trusting a single thing this man said. Standing in the wreckage of a plane, soaked in the silence of an Oregon forest, she believed him completely. And that frightened her more than anything else that had happened today. Chapter 2. The fire was the first thing that cracked the image she had built of him. Georgina sat on a flat rock near the wreckage and watched Finlay Hardins work. He had stripped off his ruined suit jacket. His white dress shirt, its sleeves rolled to the elbows, was smeared with dirt and engine soot. He was crouched on the damp forest floor, working with a piece of salvaged metal and a length of dry branch with a focus so complete it excluded everything else. These were the same hands she had watched type dismissive one-line replies to her carefully reasoned emails. The same hands that had slid a boardroom presentation across the table with a cold start over-scrawled in red across the cover page. Now they were raw and bleeding at the knuckles, working to coax fire from friction and bark. How do you know how to do that? The question escaped her before she could stop it. He did not look up. The muscles along his forearm flexed as he worked the spindle against a bark board he had fashioned. "My father," he said. His voice was neutral, a low, even tone against the whisper of wood on wood. "Before he died, he took me into the mountains every summer. He believed a man who could not survive without his bank account was not really a man at all. A thread of smoke, thin and hopeful, spiraled upward." Georgina held her breath. Finlay leaned in, cupping his hands around the small heat source, blowing with absolute gentleness. A tiny ember glowed orange in the dusk. It grew. And then, impossibly, a small flame took hold, dancing between his palms like something alive. He sat back on his heels and looked at the flame. Something in his expression softened, a nearly imperceptible release of tension across his shoulders, as if he had been holding his breath since the moment the plane went down and had only just now allowed himself to exhale. Camp took shape around that fire over the next 2 hours. Finlay worked with the same methodical precision he applied to corporate acquisitions, salvaging a large intact panel of the jet's cabin lining, stripping copper wire from the seat frames, rigging a lean-to shelter between 2 massive firs with an efficiency that was frankly startling. Georgina tried to be useful. She gathered wood. He had already located a better supply from a fallen log on the dry side of a slope. She sorted through salvageable items from the wreck. He had already mentally triaged: water container, fire kit, insulation, protein. She felt, for the first time in 2 years in his vicinity, completely outmatched. "Do you know how to tie a taut line hitch?" He held up a length of salvaged cord without looking at her. "Not exactly," she said, hating the admission. "Come here. I will show you." He stepped behind her, his voice low, and even as he guided her hands through the motion, he was close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the darkening air. He smelled of wood smoke and something else, something underneath the day's crisis: cedar, faintly expensive, unmistakably him. His fingers brushed hers as he adjusted the knot. The contact sent a jolt up her arm that had nothing to do with the cold. She stepped away, her heartbeat unsteady. "Why are you like this out here?" He paused, the rope still in his hands. "Like what?" "Different. Patient. Like an actual human being." A silence. He set the rope down and turned to face her fully, his pale eyes steady in the firelight. "In the office, I play a role," he said finally, settling onto a log beside the fire. "My father's old partner, the man who co-managed the firm after my parents died, spent years convincing me that the only way to lead was to remove every variable that could not be controlled, including emotion." He paused, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Out here, there is no role to play. There is only this." He gestured at the surrounding dark. "Only survival," Georgina said. "Only survival," he agreed. The temperature dropped sharply as the night advanced. Despite the fire, a bone-seeping cold crept up from the ground, insidious and invasive. Georgina wrapped her arms around herself, her jaw clenching against the tremor she refused to let become obvious. He noticed. Without a word, he stood and shrugged off what remained of his suit jacket, the single largest piece of fabric either of them had. He crossed the fire and held it out. "No," she said immediately. "You will freeze. I run warmer than you. Take it, Georgina." His voice was firm but stripped of its usual corporate edge. It was simply certain. The use of her first name, the first time she could remember him using it, cut through her protest more effectively than any argument. She took the jacket. The fabric was still warm from his body. It smelled like the day had smoke, forest, and underneath, that cedar and something indefinably him scent that she was beginning to suspect she would spend a long time trying to forget. He gave a single nod, returned to his side of the fire, and sat rubbing his forearms against the cold without complaint. She watched him. Something shifted in her chest, a tectonic event, slow and grinding. 2 years of carefully arranged certainty beginning to move. "Thank you," she said, very quietly, across the fire. He inclined his head. His eyes were already heavy. She could not sleep. She watched the fire, and she watched him. And at some point she noticed the tremors running through his body. Small, controlled, but there. She got up and walked around the fire. "What are you doing?" His voice was thick. "Sharing." She sat beside him on the log, close enough that their arms and thighs pressed together, and draped the jacket over both of them like a single inadequate blanket. "You do not have to. I know." A long silence. Then, slowly, so slowly it was nearly imperceptible, he let himself lean fractionally into her. Just a degree. Just enough to acknowledge the warmth. Georgina sat very still, her heart striking a slow, strange rhythm against her ribs. She was acutely conscious of every point of contact. His shoulder solid against hers. His presence beside her, warm and steady and real. She had spent 2 years being certain about this man. Sitting under a sky full of unfamiliar stars, sharing a jacket and a fire they had built to stay alive. She was less certain than she had ever been about anything. Quick pause. If you're loving these billionaire love stories, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Always remember that this channel continues to thrive because of the love you show. Thank you. Now, let's find out what happened in the remaining minutes of the story. Chapter 3. She woke to the smell of something cooking over wood smoke, and for one drowsy, suspended moment, she forgot where she was. Then the hard ground against her hip remembered her. She sat up, her back protesting the night's accommodation. Finlay's jacket was still around her shoulders. Across the dying embers of the fire, Finlay himself was crouched beside a small clear stream she had not registered in the chaos of the day before. He was turning 2 small silvery fish on improvised green branch skewers over a rebuilt fire with the calm, unhurried competence of a man who had apparently done this before. "You fished," she said. Her voice came out like gravel. He looked back at her over his shoulder, and Georgina experienced something she had never once associated with Finlay Hardins in the prior 2 years of knowing him. A smile. Not the controlled, boardroom-appropriate half-curve she had occasionally seen him deploy at investors. This was something else entirely, small, a little hesitant, almost shy. It was the smile of a man who was out of practice. "Found the stream about a quarter-mile that way," he said, nodding toward the ridge. "Woke up early. And caught them with, what exactly? Improvisation." He held up one of the skewers. The fish sizzled, its skin perfectly crisped. "Eat. We need the energy." They settled into a rhythm over the following 2 days, a quiet, wordless division of labor that felt less like a negotiated agreement and more like something that had simply always been true. Finlay hunted and foraged for water, maintained the camp structure, and explored the perimeter looking for high ground and a way out. Georgina, who held a degree in communications and a secret lifelong obsession with botany inherited from her grandmother in Savannah, became the forest's interpreter. Her grandmother, Estelle, had spent 50 years documenting the medicinal and edible properties of plants across the American Southeast. She had pressed specimens into journals that lined an entire wall of her house on Abercorn Street. Georgina had spent her childhood memorizing them, had always considered it a slightly eccentric personal hobby with no practical application. The Pacific Northwest was not Savannah, but the principles transferred. She found broad waxy leaves that, layered correctly, could waterproof the lean-to's roof. She identified edible roots and cross-checked them against memory with painstaking care. She located a plant with soft, pulpy inner leaves that she knew from her grandmother's journals had measurable antiseptic properties. How do you know all this? He was sitting on a log, very still, while she cleaned the gash on his forehead with a paste she had ground from the leaves. It had been 2 days. The wound was inflamed, and she had been watching it with a rising concern she had not voiced. "My grandmother," she said. Her focus was entirely on his temple, on the task. She could walk through a garden and name everything in it, what it cured, what it killed. "I used to follow her everywhere with a sketch pad." He was quiet. She was aware of how close she was. She could feel the warmth of his skin, could see the faint shadow of a scar just above his eyebrow she had never noticed before, the kind acquired in childhood. His eyes, she realized, were not simply pale blue. They were pale gray with a ring of darker blue at the outer edge, like ice over deep water. She applied the paste. His jaw tightened fractionally, but he did not pull away. Her thumb lingered a half-second too long against his temple. His breath changed. Their eyes met, and the air between them did something it had never done before. It went thick and charged and electric, and Georgina stepped back sharply, her heartbeat suddenly very loud in her ears. "All done," she said, her voice commendably steady. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Thank you." That afternoon, while Georgina was gathering a fresh supply of pine resin for the lean-to roof, Finlay stopped walking mid-step and raised one hand in a sharp, wordless halt. She froze. "Listen," he said, barely a sound. She focused, and then she understood what he was hearing, which was nothing. The forest had gone completely, unnaturally silent. No birds. No rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. The world was holding its breath. Finlay. He was already moving, placing himself between her and the densest wall of shadow to the north. "Stay behind me." She moved without being asked. They found the tracks at the edge of the stream bed, pressed deep into soft clay. Enormous. Each print larger than Georgina's open hand, the claw marks driven an inch into the earth. "What kind of animal?" she started, her voice barely functional. Finlay crouched over the print, his face carefully controlled. "Something large. Feline." His eyes came up to meet hers. "Mountain lion, possibly larger." They walked back to camp in silence. That night, Finlay built the fire twice as large, creating a circle of light that pushed the darkness back to the treeline. He found the sharpest piece of aircraft aluminum in the wreck and spent an hour against a flat stone, working its edge into something that could, if necessary, be used as a weapon. He fashioned it to a length of dense hardwood with strips of salvaged seat leather. "We will take watches," he said. 2 hours on, 2 hours rest. "I will go first." Georgina nodded and tried to sleep. She failed. The growl came just before midnight, low, guttural, vibrating through the ground itself. 2 yellow eyes appeared at the treeline, catching the firelight like hot coals. Georgina sat up. Finlay was already standing, the improvised spear in his hand, his body between her and the dark. "Do not move," he said, his voice barely breath. "Whatever happens." The cat stepped into the edge of the firelight, a massive dark shape, all controlled power and slow, terrifying deliberation. And Finlay Hardins stepped to meet it. Chapter 4. He did not charge. Georgina had braced herself for something. A lunge, a shout, some desperate collision of man and animal in the dark. Instead, Finlay moved to the fire in a single swift motion and seized a burning branch by its unlit end, sweeping it in a controlled arc and hurling it into the darkness between their camp and the tree. It landed in an explosion of sparks. The cat recoiled, a low, furious sound tearing from its chest, its body coiling backward on instinct. Finlay grabbed a second branch. "Get back!" The shout that came out of him was nothing she had heard before. It was not the measured boardroom authority she knew. It was something far older, something from the bottom of the chest, a sound of pure primal command that seemed to silence the entire forest. He threw the second branch, then the third, creating a rough arc of scattered flame between the camp and the animal. The cat paced the boundary with enormous, fluid steps, 20 feet of shadow and muscle, its eyes moving between the flames and the man holding his ground. For a long, suspended moment, it was purely a contest of will. The cat let out a final roar, the kind of sound that lives in old, animal parts of the brain and registers as nothing but danger. Then it turned and dissolved back into the darkness. Gone. Georgina let out the breath she had been holding since midnight. Finlay stood at the edge of the firelight for another long moment, every muscle still coiled, before he slowly turned. She was staring at him. "It will circle back," he said, as if they were discussing a scheduling conflict. "We keep the fire high." He did not sit. For the rest of the night, he stood or walked the perimeter of their small camp, feeding the fire at regular intervals, the spear held in a loose, ready grip. Georgina tried to stay awake beside him. The adrenaline held her for 2 hours. Then her body overruled her mind, and she tipped sideways against the log and slept a broken, dream-threaded sleep full of yellow eyes and dark shapes at the edge of firelight. She woke to gray dawn and the sound of birdsong returning to the forest. Finlay was still standing. He was leaning against a fir tree now, the spear angled to the earth, but his eyes were still moving, still watching the wood line with a focus that had outlasted the night. "You did not sleep." She scrambled up, a spike of guilt and something sharper through her chest. "At all. Could not risk it." "Finlay." She crossed to him. Up close, the cost of the night was written clearly on his face, the bruised shadows under his eyes, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands. "You have to rest. I will keep watch. You do not know. I know how to feed a fire. And I know how to scream." She held his gaze, unflinching. "Let me take care of you. Just for a few hours." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, a long, silent war between stubbornness and the body's honest accounting of its limits. Then he nodded once, sharp and reluctant, and lay down near the fire on the bed of dried leaves and salvaged fabric they had arranged the day before. She expected him to be unconscious in seconds. He was not. She could see the tension in him, the inability to stop the systems that had been running on high alert for 48 straight hours. "I cannot," he said, his voice rough with frustration. "I cannot switch it off." Without thinking about it at all, Georgina sat down on the ground beside him and reached for his hand. He went completely still. His eyes flew to hers, wide and startled in a way she had never seen him. His hand was cold in hers, the knuckles raw from the night's work, his fingers long and oddly gentle in her grip. "I am right here," she said quietly. "Nothing is going to happen while I am awake. I will come get you if anything changes." He stared at their joined hands for a moment that stretched like taffy. Then, very slowly, as if the motion were something that required great deliberateness, his fingers curled between hers. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered, his gaze on her face now. Georgina did not have a clean answer. The clean answers were the wrong ones. She said the true thing, the one that surfaced from somewhere below logic. "Because you would have done the same for me." Something shifted in his face. The hard-carved lines around his mouth softened. His eyes, those pale glacier and deep water eyes, closed. And Finlay Hardins, who had apparently not slept since the plane had come apart around them, finally let himself go. He was asleep within minutes. Georgina sat beside him for 3 hours, her hand still in his, watching the rise and fall of his chest, watching the forest, keeping the fire stoked. She noted the way sleep erased the architecture of control from his face. Without it, he looked younger. He looked like the person he might have been before whoever had taught him to wear that mask had gotten to him. When he woke, the sun was high and dappled. His eyes found hers immediately. Then he looked at their still joined hands. Neither of them moved to separate. "Thank you," he said. "Always," Georgina heard herself answer. It sounded more like a promise than she had intended. He sat up slowly and looked at her for a long moment before he spoke again, his voice careful and deliberate, as if each word cost something. "At the office, the way I was with you. The way I was with all of them." He paused, his gaze dropping to their still-linked fingers. "That is not what I wanted to be. I never wanted to be that to you specifically." "Then why?" He was quiet for a long time. "Because the man who raised me after my parents died told me that leaders do not feel. That the only safe relationship is a transactional one. That caring is the thing that gets used against you." His voice cracked on the last sentence. "Just slightly. Just enough." "Show what?" Georgina said gently, because she could hear where the sentence wanted to end. He looked up, and in his eyes, those controlled, calculating, boardroom eyes, she saw something she had never been meant to see. Something that made her chest ache. "That he cares," Finlay said. And there, in the middle of an Oregon forest, everything Georgina Watkins thought she knew tilted irreversibly on its axis. Chapter 5. The rain came with no warning at all. One moment the forest was the ordinary gray-green of an overcast afternoon. The next, the sky cracked and opened with a violence that felt almost personal. Rain hammered the canopy in solid sheets, driving through the Douglas fir needles and cascading onto the lean-to in a roar. The structure shuddered. Within minutes, water was finding its way through every gap in the layered bark roof, streaming down the cabin lining panels in cold rivulets that had nowhere to go but down. The fire did not stand a chance. It fought for 3 minutes and then died with a defeated hiss, drowning under the deluge and plunging their small camp into a darkness that was immediately, viscerally cold. The cold was different from the previous nights. The rain stripped body heat in a way the dry cold had not. Within minutes, Georgina was shaking with a force that rattled her teeth against each other. "We need to conserve body heat," Finlay said, his voice tight against the roar of rain. "Hypothermia is a real risk in this temperature." He did not ask permission. He pulled her into the driest corner of the lean-to, a few feet of relative shelter where the structure met the largest fir trunk, turned his back to the wind, and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. Georgina did not resist. Her body was already making its own calculations about warmth and survival and the irrelevance of professional distance when you were hypothermic in the rain. His body, though cold and soaked, was a furnace compared to the night air. She pressed into him without shame. They were two people in a storm, and that was all. And in the dark and the roar of rain, he began to talk. She was not sure he meant to, or if he even fully knew he was doing it. His voice came low and steady, vibrating through his chest where her ear was pressed, and the words came out like water finding the path of least resistance. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 15, he said. "Black ice, outside Edinburgh, on the way home from a family dinner." He paused. "My uncle Callum took me in. He took over the firm too. My father had built it from nothing, 23 years of his life in that company." Georgina listened, her arms wrapped around his ribs, feeling every word in her sternum. "Callum sat me down the first week and told me the world was full of people waiting for vulnerability to exploit. That the only people who could be trusted were the ones who knew how to maintain controlled distance. He said my father had been too warm, too trusting." He was quiet for a moment. "I was 15. I was grieving. And he told me grief was a luxury and emotion was a liability, and the only way to survive in our world was to become something the world could not read." The rain was relentless. Georgina said nothing. She just held on. "At the office, you used to look at me like I was someone to be endured," he said. "You were," she said honestly, into the dark. A beat of silence. I know. I earned it. His arms tightened around her. But I hated being that person. I just did not know how to be anything else. In the darkness, she felt his hand move to her face, his cold fingers finding her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw in a gesture so careful and tender that it knocked the breath out of her. Here, I cannot perform, he said. And the honest truth is, I do not want to. I am so tired of the performance. Georgina covered his hand with hers, holding it against her face. Then do not. You do not have to relearn how to be someone different. You just have to remember who you were before someone else decided that for you. She paused, finding him in the dark. The person who stayed up all night in the cold to keep watch. The person who faced down a mountain lion for someone he barely tolerates at the office. She felt him shift. That is the real Finlay, not the machine in the boardroom. I do not tolerate you, he said, his voice quiet. I never did. Then what did you do? A long pause. Then, I noticed you. Every single day. And I had no idea what to do with that. The storm held around them. Georgina let out a breath that had been coiled tight for 2 years and 3 months. I hated you, she said, because honesty seemed to be the only currency that worked out here. You were cold and precise, and you made me feel invisible, and I hated you for all of it. She paused. But you are not that person. And now that I can see that, now that I can see you, I have absolutely no idea what to do with it either. His breath shifted. She felt him lean in, his forehead finding hers, their breath mingling in the cold air between them. When we get back, he said, his voice low and careful, I will have to go back to some version of that life. The firm, the board, they will not just disappear. Then do not go back to that version of yourself, she said. Go back to this one. He was quiet for a moment. If I kiss you right now, I will not be able to pretend it did not happen. Georgina felt the whole complicated weight of that sentence and chose it anyway. Then do not pretend, she said. He kissed her. It was not a gentle first kiss. It was the kiss of two people who had been holding something back for longer than either of them could honestly account for. Desperate and raw, weighted with fear and relief, and everything the forest had stripped down to its truth. She kissed him back with all of it. When they finally pulled apart, he did not release her. He held her against his chest and pressed his mouth to the top of her head, and in the violent dark of the storm, Georgina felt something settle in her bones that had not been settled in a very long time. I do not want to go back to that man, he murmured into her hair, his voice a vow made to the rain. I want to choose, for the first time in my life. The storm kept raging, but inside their small, ruined shelter, something had been built that no weather could reach. Chapter 6. The morning after the storm, the forest was washed clean and brilliant, and something between them had permanently rearranged. The tension that had defined their previous 48 hours, the careful distance, the unspoken and contradictory currents, was gone. It had been replaced by something quieter and more dangerous, ease. They moved around each other differently, not like boss and employee, not even like two people managing shared crisis, but like two people who had begun to know how the other moved and moved accordingly. A hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing when a tool changed hands, glances that landed and stayed a beat longer than strictly necessary. We cannot stay here, Finlay said that morning, scanning the sky through a gap in the canopy. We have been down for 4 days. Rescue teams will have a search radius. We need to get to high ground, build a visible signal fire, something large enough to be seen from the air. He nodded toward the southeast, where the forested slope gave way to a distant rocky ridge. It looked impossibly far. Its upper slopes looked steep and punishing even from here. You think we can make it? Georgina asked. He turned to her and reached for her hand, his fingers lacing through hers with a naturalness that still made her breath catch. Together, he said. Yes. The word landed differently than any of the authoritative proclamations she had heard from him across 100 conference tables. This one cost something to say. This one was offered, not declared. They spent the morning preparing. Finlay fashioned 2 packs from the salvaged jet lining, lashing the frames with braided seat wire. They inventoried everything: a plastic water bottle filled from the stream, a bundle of edible roots Georgina had dried near the fire, the improvised spear and fire kit, the torn red fabric from the emergency ceiling panels, the only distinctly visible color either of them possessed. "You are different," Georgina said, adjusting the strap across his shoulder. He turned to look at her. "You are too." "Am I?" "At work," he said, his voice careful. "You walked with your shoulders forward, like you were trying to take up the minimum amount of space the job required." He studied her. "Out here you do not do that. Out here you look like you belong exactly where you are." Georgina felt the warmth in her face before she could manage a response. "Maybe that is because out here I am not invisible." "You were never invisible to me," Finlay said, quiet and direct. "I was just too deep inside my own performance to show you that." She held his gaze. Then she picked up her pack. "Lead the way." The first mile of the ascent was deceptively navigable. The forest floor was relatively open, the slope gentle, and they fell into a comfortable rhythm. Finlay slightly ahead, reading the terrain, Georgina noting the flora on either side and filing each one against her grandmother's taxonomy. Then the trees changed. The forest grew older and denser as the slopes steepened, the canopy closing above them into a ceiling of interlocked branches that filtered the daylight to a dim, underwater green. The sounds changed, becoming more muffled. The undergrowth thickened. The ground grew soft in ways that suggested poor drainage, old ground, undisturbed ground. Georgina saw it first. "Finlay." Her voice came out wrong, a strangled whisper. He was at her side instantly. "What?" She pointed to the base of a mossy slope. Half buried in the earth and leaf litter, pale and yellowed with age, was a human bone. A femur, long and unmistakable. Finlay's blood ran cold in a way that was visible even to her. "That could be," he started. His foot came down on something that had no business being on a remote Oregon forest floor. Something metallic. Something with a trigger. The snare took him off the ground so fast Georgina screamed before she even understood what was happening. A thick rope loop tightening around his ankle, a counterweight system lunging in the opposite direction, and suddenly Finlay Hardins was hanging 8 feet in the air, swinging in a slow, terrible arc, blood rushing to his face. "Finlay!" She scrambled forward. "Stop! Do not!" His voice, strained and urgent. "Georgina, you need to go. Now. Run. I am not leaving you." And then she heard the drums. Low, rhythmic, far away but getting closer with every frantic beat of her heart. "Go." His voice was breaking now, with something beyond pain. "Please. If they find you too, we lose everything. Hide, and do not come out until it is safe. I will find you. I promise I will find you." Georgina looked at him for one terrible moment. Then she ran. Chapter 7. The hollow of the massive cedar was barely wide enough to stand in. Georgina pressed her back against the rotted inner wood and made herself as small as possible, her hands pressed over her mouth, her heart slamming against her ribs with a force that seemed audible. Through a crack in the bark, she could see the approach of the drumbeat, shapes moving between the firs with practiced stealth. Figures in dark hides and carved wooden masks, their faces obscured, their voices a low, guttural chant in a language she had never heard. She counted 8 of them, then 12. They surrounded the spot where Finlay hung like experts. No surprise, no hesitation. One of them used the butt of a spear to set him swinging while the others laughed, that hollow, joyless laugh. Then a cord knife sliced through the snare rope. Finlay hit the forest floor with a sound that made her flinch. They bound his hands and feet with fibrous cord and hoisted him onto their shoulders like a prize they had been expecting, and the procession moved east into the trees. Before the forest swallowed him, Finlay turned his head. His eyes swept the tree line with desperate precision. They found the crack in the cedar where she was hiding. She was certain of it. His gaze landed exactly there and held for 3 long seconds. Not fear. Not despair. A command, silent and absolute. Survive. And come for me. Then he was gone. Georgina stood in the hollow tree for a long time. She was not sure how long. Her body shook with a force she could not control, and she let it shake until it ran out. Then she pressed her palms against her thighs, breathed in through her nose for 4 counts, out for 4, and made herself think. The panic wanted her to run. The panic wanted her to pick a direction, any direction, and move until she found a road or a river or something that was not this. But running blind would get her killed or lost in a forest that had already demonstrated its capacity for ambush. She thought about Finlay standing between her and the cat 3 nights ago. She thought about him awake all night with a spear in his hand. She thought about his forehead against hers in the rain, his voice saying, "I want to choose for the first time in my life." She stepped out of the hollow tree and followed the trail east. They had not tried to hide it. Broken branches, compressed moss, fibrous cord fragments. The trail of a group who moved through their territory with the confidence of undisputed ownership. 20 minutes of careful, painstaking movement through the undergrowth brought her to the edge of an unexpected clearing. She dropped flat, moving slowly through the ferns until she had a view of what lay ahead. It was a village, not improvised, established, substantial, smoke rising from a dozen small cook fires. Thatched structures. Dozens of people moving in the patterns of daily life. At the center, staked to a post driven deep into the earth, was Finlay. He was alive. His head was bowed with exhaustion, a fresh cut sluggish on his cheekbone. But he was alive and upright, and as she watched, he lifted his head and began to scan the tree line with the slow, deliberate attention of a man who had not given up. He was looking for her. Georgina lay in the ferns for hours, watching. She mapped the guard rotation, identified the blind angles, noted the placement of the fires. She was not going to run. She was not going to hide and wait to be found. She had a plan forming, a terrible, reckless, possibly insane plan, and it was the only card she had. She remembered something from an anthropology course in her 3rd year at the University of Georgia. Her professor had lectured on the symbolic significance of apex predators in isolated cultures, the way certain indigenous communities viewed the mountain lion not merely as an animal, but as an agent of the spirit world, messenger of the dead, harbinger of judgment. She needed the cat. She needed the mountain lion they had been afraid of for 3 nights to follow her through those trees and into the center of that village. She moved back toward the stream. Chapter 8. Finding the cat was easier than it should have been. She had circled back toward the creek where they had first found the tracks, moving slowly, deliberately, her senses on maximum alert. She had been gathering flat, throwing stones from the creek bed, the heaviest she could manage, when she felt the weight of being washed pressed down on the back of her neck like a physical thing. She turned. The mountain lion was 15 feet away, perched on a low outcrop with the relaxed posture of a creature that had been there for a while, watching her the whole time. Its coat was dark tawny gold, its yellow-green eyes unblinking, its tail flicking once in a long, slow arc. Every cell in Georgina's body performed the calculation simultaneously. Run, climb, freeze, play dead. She took a stone from her pocket and threw it. It was not aimed to hurt. It bounced off the rock 3 inches from the cat's left paw. The effect was immediate. The mountain lion came off the rock in a fluid motion, ears flat, a low sustained growl rolling from its chest that Georgina felt in her teeth. "Come on," she whispered, stepping backward in the direction of the village, slow and deliberate. "Come on, come with me." She threw another stone. It landed closer. The cat dropped into a crouch. Georgina turned and ran. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life. Not sprinting blindly, but running a calculated line, weaving through the trees, keeping to the path she had memorized coming in. Behind her, the mountain lion came. The sound of its movement was terrifyingly quiet for its size, a barely audible percussion of paws on soft forest floor, but she could feel it gaining in the vibration of the earth. Closer, closer. The fires of the village appeared through the trees, burning orange in the gathering dark. She could hear the sounds of the settlement, voices, the crackle of wood, the distant clang of something metallic. She burst out of the tree-line screaming, not from fear, from strategy. The loudest, most primal human sound she could produce, at full volume, bursting into the firelit clearing at a full sprint. The mountain lion, blinded by its own momentum and the sudden eruption of noise and fire and movement, followed her out of the trees 2 seconds later. The result was immediate and total. The village exploded. The mountain lion represented something in this culture that was exactly what her professor had described. Not just an animal, but an omen, a spirit, a sentence from the unseen world. Figures scattered in every direction. Cookpots overturned. Fires were abandoned. The screaming of the villagers mixed with the lion's enraged snarling into a single wall of primal chaos. In the chaos, Georgina was invisible. She ran low and hard between the huts, using the firelight and the fleeing figures as cover, her eyes locked on the post at the center of the clearing. Finlay saw her coming. His eyes went wide with something between disbelief and a terror that had nothing to do with his own captivity. "What have you done?" He breathed as she skidded to a halt, and her fingers went straight to the knots. "I am rescuing you," she panted. "Hold still. You let a mountain lion into their village." It was busy. The knots. The knots were brutal, complex and drawn brutally tight by hands that tied prisoners for a living. Her fingers slipped and fought and slipped again. Around them the chaos was not abating, but it was not permanent either. She had seconds, maybe less. "Georgina, you have to leave me." "Shut up," she said. The primary knot gave. Then the second. Finlay wrenched his hands free and attacked his own ankle bindings, his freed hands working with swift efficiency. Then he was up, grabbing her arm, and they ran. The forest swallowed them in its protective dark. They ran until the sounds of the village were gone, and the only sounds were their own ragged breathing and the soft percussion of feet on soft ground. They ran until their bodies physically refused the command. They fell into a hidden hollow behind a rock outcrop, gasping, shaking, alive. "You," Finlay started, still fighting for air, staring at her. "You lured a mountain lion through a village to get me out." Georgina let out a sound that was mostly sob and slightly laugh. It seemed like the most direct approach. He stared at her for another moment, something moving through his face that she could not name. Then he reached forward and pulled her into his arms with a fierce, absolute grip that squeezed the last of her breath out. "You could have been killed," he said into her hair. "So could you. That is why I came." He pulled back just far enough to frame her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing the dirt and tears from her cheekbones. "Why?" he said. "You could have kept going. Found high ground, made the signal fire. Because partners do not leave each other behind," she said. Her voice was low and steady and completely certain. "That is not something you negotiate." The word landed. She watched it arrive behind his eyes and rearrange something fundamental. "Partners," he repeated, as if testing the weight of a word he had never been allowed to use before. That night they made camp far from the village, a cold camp with no fire. In the dark, pressed together for warmth and something more than warmth, Georgina heard Finlay's voice in the quiet, very low, rough with something she recognized as the last piece of a wall coming down. "I love you, Georgina." She turned to look at him. He met her gaze without flinching, without the boardroom mask, without anything between them but the dark and the truth. "I think I have since the moment I realized you were the only person in my entire company who was not afraid of me," he said. "You were never afraid. You were just furious. And somehow that felt like being seen." She kissed him. She kissed him until the dark forest and the danger and the whole impossible week of it felt like the most reasonable thing that had ever led to this. "I love you too," she said against his lips. "Now please do not get taken prisoner again. I am running out of strategies." He laughed, a sound so genuine and unguarded that it seemed to briefly light up the forest around them. "I will do my absolute best." Chapter 9. The helicopter was the sound of a world she had almost forgotten. Georgina was already awake when it came, a mechanical chopping rhythm cutting through the forest quiet in the gray pre-dawn, distant at first and then unmistakably closer. She was on her feet before the sound fully registered. "Finlay." She grabbed his shoulder, shaking. Wake up right now." He was upright in a single motion, his body trained by a week of threat response. His eyes found hers. She pointed at the sky. They scrambled out of the hollow and into the nearest clearing, waving and screaming at a dark shape above the cloud layer. The helicopter moved past them without slowing. The silence that followed was the worst silence she had ever heard. Then it returned. "Lower. They cannot see us through the canopy," Finlay said, already scanning. "We need to make a visual signal. Something they can see from above." His eyes landed on the backpacks, specifically on the torn strips of the emergency ceiling liner from the jet cabin. The original color had faded to a dusty rose, but it was still distinctly artificial against the natural greens and browns of the forest floor. They tore the fabric into the widest strips they could manage and spread them across the open ground of the clearing, anchoring each piece with heavy stones, working fast, and in the practiced silence of people who had learned each other's rhythms. They made an X, rough, imperfect, and brilliant against the earth. Then they stood and watched the sky. The helicopter made another pass. Then another. Georgina was gripping Finlay's hand hard enough to hurt, and he was gripping back just as hard, and neither of them said anything, because saying anything felt like it might disturb the fragile probability of being found. The helicopter banked. It began to descend. Georgina pressed her face against Finlay's shoulder and let herself cry for the first time since the plane had gone down. The noise was extraordinary. Rotor wash flattening the undergrowth around the small clearing, the mechanical roar filling the world. A rescue technician in an orange flight suit descended on a cable, his voice professionally calm, asking questions she could barely process. "How many survivors?" "2. Duration of exposure?" 6 days. "Critical injuries?" Finlay caught her eye across the noise and held it. He looked like a man emerging from a long and difficult sentence. Not relieved exactly. Not broken. Just profoundly, quietly real. His face stripped of all performance. The scar at his temple dark against pale skin. His shirt in tatters. His eyes holding everything she now knew lived behind them. She reached for his hand again. He took it. On the floor of the helicopter, wrapped in emergency thermal blankets that crinkled with every movement, the paramedic moved between them with practiced efficiency while the machine climbed above the tree line and the great green cathedral of the forest receded beneath them. It was over. 6 days. She had spent 6 days in that forest, and it felt like a lifetime of rearrangement. "What happens now?" she said. The question was out before she could apply careful phrasing. Finlay looked at her. His thumb moved slowly across the back of her hand. "Nothing changes," he said quietly. They both knew it was the most optimistic thing either of them had ever said, because everything was about to change. Chapter 10. The media was waiting at the hospital. Of course it was. Finlay Hardins, CEO of Vantage Capital Group, billionaire, subject of 3 Forbes profiles and a Business Insider character study titled The Last of the Truly Cold Executives, had been missing for 6 days. The private jet had been found 4 days ago. The search operation had involved 2 state agencies and a private security firm. The story had been front page and trending for the better part of a week. The helicopter landed on the hospital rooftop, and they were walked down a corridor and into a waiting room where people in scrubs began assessing them with the brisk efficiency of professionals accustomed to retrieving the recently lost. Georgina was still in Finlay's torn jacket, wearing it over what remained of her blazer, her hair tangled and wild around her face. The moment the hospital's front entrance came into view, the cameras went off like a storm. Flashes, shouting, microphones, security personnel trying to create a corridor that the press was actively ignoring. Finlay's arm went around her shoulders. Not a romantic gesture, a protective one, his body positioning itself between the cameras and her face. She felt his jaw set against the noise. A reporter broke through. Young, tenacious, holding a microphone toward Finlay with the determination of someone who had been waiting 4 days for exactly this shot. "Mr. Hardins, can you speak to the nature of your relationship with your employee during the 6 days you were missing?" Georgina braced herself. She had built no expectations about this moment. She had specifically avoided building them. The world they were walking back into was not the forest. In the forest, there were no shareholders, no boardrooms, no corporate reputation management. Out here, there was all of that and more, and she understood exactly what the professionally logical response to that question was. Denial, distance, careful corporate language about shared ordeal and mutual respect. Finlay stopped walking. He turned to face the camera directly. The full force of him, exhausted and scarred, and completely unmasked. And when he spoke, his voice was clear and carrying and left absolutely no room for interpretation. "Georgina Watkins saved my life," he said, multiple times. "If I am alive, it is because of her intelligence, her courage, and her refusal to leave when leaving would have been the rational choice." He paused. "She is the most remarkable person I have ever known. And I love her." The crowd went silent for a fraction of a second. Then it erupted. Georgina stood very still beside him, her heart doing something unsteady in her chest. He turned to look at her, his pale eyes open and clear and utterly without a mask. He reached for her hand and lifted it, deliberately, in full view of every camera on the lawn. And then, for the first time since she had known him, he smiled at her in public. Not the controlled half expression, his actual smile. The one she had first seen in the forest, crouching over a fire with fish on a stick. Wide open and unguarded and brilliant and entirely, irreversibly real. Chapter 11. The hospital room was quiet for 2 days. 2 days of 4 fluids and wound care, and the particular luxury of sleeping in a room with 4 walls and a door that locked. Georgina sat in the chair beside Finlay's bed more often than the nurses strictly permitted, and when she was not there she was in the room they had given her down the hall, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the shape of everything that had happened. On the 3rd day, the door opened without a knock. The man who entered was in his early 60s, impeccably suited, with a bearing that suggested the room had been rearranged to accommodate him simply by the fact of his entrance. He had Finlay's build, but none of his stillness. There was something coiled and predatory in the set of his shoulders, something that reminded Georgina of the mountain lion without the lion's honest hunger. Callum Hardins. She recognized him from the company archives. Finlay's uncle. The architect. "Leave," he said to Georgina. He did not look at her when he said it. Finlay, who had been upright in bed reading when the door opened, put the papers down with deliberate calm. "She stays," he said. Callum closed the door with a soft, precise click. When he turned to face his nephew, his expression was a compound of fury and something that might have been, underneath it all, genuine worry, though the fury was doing a thorough job of obscuring it. "You have lost your mind," Callum said, low and contained. A public declaration, in front of cameras, for A. His eyes moved to Georgina for the first time, a slow, dismissive scan. "For a junior employee. Georgina is not my employee," Finlay said. "She was 4 days ago. The board is calling it a trauma bond. They are suggesting. I know what they are suggesting." Finlay swung his legs over the edge of the bed, ignoring the pull of the 4 line, and stood to face his uncle at equal height. "They are wrong. The company's share price dropped 4 points off your press conference. For investors have called the chair expressing concern about your stability. Then let them be concerned." Callum blinked. It was, Georgina thought. Likely the first time in many years that Finlay Hardins had delivered a sentence with no calculation behind it. What? You spent 17 years building me into something that functioned beautifully for the firm and cost me everything else, Finlay said. His voice was controlled, but the emotion underneath was visible and deliberate. He was choosing to let it be visible. I was 15 years old when I lost my parents, and you told me grief was a liability. I believed you. I spent 17 years living inside the thing you made, and it nearly cost me my life, and it completely cost me myself. A silence. That is not. I am done, Finlay said simply. With the performance. I am not going back to it. Callum's face went through several rapid calculations. When it arrived at its conclusion, it was cold and certain. I hold 42% of the voting shares. More than enough to challenge your position if I bring the board in on it. Then do it, Finlay said. I mean that. The silence that followed was absolute. The two men stood across the sterile hospital room, and Georgina watched the moment decide which way it would fall. Callum took one step back. His voice was cold and final, and carrying a future threat in every syllable. You will regret this. Probably, Finlay agreed, and there was no bravado in it. But it will be my own life to regret. Callum looked at Georgina one last time. It was a look she did not try to return, because what was in it was not worth engaging. Then the door opened and closed, and he was gone. The moment the latch clicked, the bravado drained out of Finlay like water through a crack. He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, his head dropping forward, his hands loose between his knees. Hey! Her hands went to his face, tilting it up. That was the bravest thing I have ever watched someone do. I just ended 20 years of my professional life in a hospital room, he said. No. She kept his face in her hands, steady. You chose your actual life. Those are not the same thing. He covered her hands with his. What if I chose wrong? Then we build something else. Her voice did not waver. We have built quite a bit from nothing already. He looked at her. The smile came slowly. The real one. The one that lived below the mask. Together, he said. Together. Chapter 12. 2 weeks after the helicopter pulled them out of the forest, Finlay was sitting at a corner table in a small independent coffee shop on Northwest 23rd Avenue in Portland when Georgina walked through the door. She had walked past this coffee shop most mornings on her way into the Vantage Capital offices. She had never been inside. Too expensive, she had always thought, which was amusing in retrospect, given the company she had been keeping. He stood when he saw her. Of course he did. The same instinctive physical attentiveness that had surprised her every time in the forest. He was wearing a navy crewneck sweater and dark jeans, no suit, no tie, and the absence of the corporate armor still startled her slightly. He looked younger. He looked like himself. 2 coffees waited. He had remembered what she took. No sugar, a splash of oat milk. With the same quiet precision he applied to everything. I have a proposal, he said. Once they had settled across from each other in the worn leather chairs by the window, the smell of ground coffee and rain-wet streets a grounding, almost overwhelming reminder of ordinary life. I am listening, she said. He leaned forward slightly, his hands around his cup. I am starting a new company. Something I build from the ground up with no inherited structure and no Callum. Design-led brand strategy, sustainable, independent, mission-driven. He met her gaze. I want you to be my partner. Equal stake. Equal voice. Not an employee, a co-founder. Georgina put her coffee down carefully. Finlay, I do not know the first thing about. You know design. You understand brand narrative in a way I never will. You can read a room, a market, a person. You could always do that. He slid his hand across the table, palm up. More than any of that, you know me. The real version. And I trust you more than I trust any other person on earth. Why would you do this? She said. Because in the forest, you showed me I do not have to do everything alone. You kept me alive in more ways than one. His voice was steady and certain. Let me build this with you. She looked at him across the small table. at the man who had made her career miserable for 2 years, the man who had built a fire with his bare hands and stood between her and a predator and kissed her in a rainstorm, and stood up to the only father figure he had known in an empty hospital room. One condition, she said. His eyes lit up. Name it. We do it right. No ruthless corners. No strategies that cost people their dignity for the sake of margin. We build something we would actually respect. Finlay did not hesitate. I would not want it any other way. His smile came. The real one, the one she had first seen in the woods. That is the entire point. They shook hands across the small table, and then, because they were themselves, he leaned across it and sealed the agreement with a soft, promising kiss that tasted of good coffee and the specific, particular flavor of new beginnings. Hartwell and Watkins opened its doors 4 months later in a rented loft space in the Pearl District with second-hand desks, a coffee machine that made questionable sounds at unpredictable intervals, and exactly 2 clients who had followed Georgina from her previous life. It was nothing like Vantage Capital. It was nothing like anything either of them had built before. It was entirely, simply, brilliantly theirs. They worked the way they had survived the forest, in an easy, complementary rhythm, each compensating for what the other lacked, each knowing when to lead and when to follow. They argued about color choices and client briefs, and whether the coffee machine needed replacing, yes, or just needed more patience, his position. They celebrated with cheap takeout and expensive wine, and the particular giddy exhaustion of people who were building something real. One evening, Georgina was at her desk surrounded by mood board scraps and brand brief printouts when she looked up and found Finlay watching her from across the room, with an expression so unguarded and so full of something she could only call wonder that she felt it like a physical thing. What? She said. He shook his head, a small private smile. Nothing. Are you happy? She looked at him for a moment, at the faint scar still visible at his temple, at the peace that had settled into the lines of his face that had not been there when she had first met him, at the man who had let her see him and had not retreated from being seen. Yes, she said. Completely. He nodded, satisfied, and returned to his work. But in the quiet back corner of her mind, a small voice was composing a question that had no clean answer yet. They had survived the forest. They had survived the hospital and the media and Callum and the reconstruction of their lives. But where exactly were they going? Chapter 13. 6 months to the day after the rescue helicopter had lifted them above the Oregon tree canopy, Finlay drove Georgina to a mountain. Not the mountain. Never that mountain. But a different one. A national park 2 hours from Portland with marked trails and cleared outlooks, and the kind of responsible, well-maintained wilderness that felt like an apology from nature for what the other one had put them through. Why are we here? She asked, as they crested the last switchback of the trail in the late afternoon, the air crisp and carrying the particular clean cold of high elevation in autumn. She was wearing a dark olive hiking jacket over a burgundy thermal, her hair pulled back under a knit hat. He was in a charcoal jacket and dark trousers, and he moved through the mountain terrain with the same easy competence she had first discovered in crisis. You will see, was all he said, which was maddening. He brought her to a rocky overlook at the summit, a wide shelf of granite above the tree line, facing west into a valley that the setting sun was currently converting into something that looked like the inside of a painting. Orange, rose, deep violet at the far edges, the kind of sky that made it difficult to believe in ordinary things. Finlay stopped walking. When Georgina turned to look at him, she saw it immediately. The thing she had learned to read on his face over the past 6 months, the slight fracture in the composed exterior that meant something was costing him. He was nervous. His hands were doing something small and fidgeting at his sides, and there was a vulnerability in his eyes, open and clear and without any barrier, that made her heart give a long, slow, suspended beat. When the plane went down, he began, his voice quiet and direct. The first thought I had, the very first thought, before survival, before anything else, was that I had wasted my entire life. Georgina held perfectly still. I had the career, the influence, the kind of numbers in accounts that other people build their entire ambitions around. And none of it, not 1 ounce of it, felt like a reason to live. He paused. And then I looked across the aisle, and there you were. And you were terrified, and you were furious at the situation, and you were holding on to the armrest with everything you had. And he stopped, cleared his throat. And I thought, if we land alive, I'm going to spend the rest of my life figuring out how to deserve that. He let go of one of her hands. He reached into his jacket pocket. He dropped to one knee on the granite. The world slowed down to the sound of Georgina's own heartbeat. I do not know what the next chapter holds for us, he said, his voice rough with feeling and completely unashamed of it. I do not know if the company will be extraordinary or just quietly good. I do not know what challenges the world will put in front of us or what other metaphorical forests we will have to navigate. He opened the box. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, was a ring, a simple platinum band with a single clear oval stone that caught the last of the sun and fractured it into dozens of small, scattered lights. What I know, with more certainty than I have known anything in my life, is that I do not want to face any of it without you. He looked up at her. Georgina Watkins, will you marry me? She was crying before she had made any decision to cry. The tears were just there, spilling over with the specific warmth of things that have been held too long. She dropped to her knees in front of him, on the cold granite, and kissed him. He laughed against her lips, surprised and delighted and warm. Is that? Yes, she said. It is a yes. It was always going to be yes. She pulled back just far enough to look at him, her hands on his face, the ridiculous tears still happening and neither of them caring. But I reserve the right to remind you of this moment the next time you try to dismiss my font choices in a brand brief. He laughed again, openly, fully, the sound carrying out over the valley below and into the wide, open, fading sky. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They sat there on the summit for a long time afterward, her head against his shoulder, watching the color drain out of the sky and the first stars appear. The same stars that had looked down on them from a foreign angle when they had been sleeping on forest ground, holding on to each other for warmth and survival. They married 8 months later in a small garden ceremony in Savannah, Georgia, in the late afternoon light of her grandmother Estelle's house on Abercorn Street. No press, no board members, no Callum, just the people who had witnessed the story from the beginning and understood what they were celebrating. Estelle, in a yellow dress and white gloves, cried without apology through the entire ceremony and spent the reception telling anyone who would listen that she had known her granddaughter would find someone worth the trouble. Took the plane crash to get there, she said, but we always did have to be shown the scenic route. At some point in the long golden evening, Finlay pulled Georgina away from the gathering toward the small fountain at the end of the garden. The sound of water and distant laughter mixed together into something that felt like peace. I have one more thing, he said, reaching into the inside pocket of his dark wedding suit. He produced a cocktail napkin, folded in quarters. She took it and unfolded it. Written in his distinct, decisive handwriting was a single sentence. Party A, Finlay, and Party B, Georgina, hereby agree, in full understanding of all terms, to love, protect, challenge, and navigate whatever comes next, together, for the full and complete duration of their shared lives. No exit clauses. Below it, already signed in his name. Our final contract, he said. Would you like to make it binding? He offered a pen. Leaning against the fountain wall in the garden of her grandmother's house, in the last light of the evening, Georgina Hardins signed her name beside his. He folded the napkin and put it back in his breast pocket, directly over his heart. Binding for a lifetime, he said. She kissed him again, in the garden, in the light. Their story had begun with a fall from the sky, violent and catastrophic and stripping everything down to the bone. It had moved through fire and cold and predators and captivity and a storm that had broken them open. It had ended here, in a garden, with a napkin contract and a ring and a grandmother in yellow crying happy tears in the front row. Sometimes you have to lose the life you thought you had to find the one that was always waiting for you. Sometimes it takes a plane crash to find your person. Georgina Watkins had known that for a long time. She had just needed the sky to fall to believe it. Hello, lovers and billionaires. We have come to the end of today's story. If you enjoyed it, take a few seconds to like the video and drop a comment, and if you're not a part of the family yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications. This is our own little corner of the internet, so be sure to visit every day because I upload exciting, emotional, and unforgettable stories every single day, and you don't want to miss what's coming next.